Good day. Today, Friday, 8th December, we find ourselves again on another day when Russia's President Vladimir Putin continues to dominate international affairs. He's just completed resplendent visits to the United Arab Emirates and to Saudi Arabia. He's received the president of Iran in Moscow. He's addressed a major investment forum in Moscow. He's had a very interesting conversation with the Crown Prince of Oman, and he's just announced that he's running again for president of Russia. And of course, the next Russian presidential election, it is now known, is timed for March of next year. Now, this had previously, the term, Putin's term, which is now ending, had been widely expected according to the Russian constitution and Russian law. It would have been Putin's last term. And I can remember that when in the early weeks of 2020, a decision was made by the Russian parliament to make it possible for Putin to stand for 2 more terms after his term limit appeared to end. Well, a lot of people, myself included, were frankly troubled and were seriously concerned about the fact that President Putin seemed to be likely to stay in office all but indefinitely. Now, since that time, since 2020, now 4 years later in 2024, I'm going to guess that the vast majority of people in Russia who have political views on these questions, and the vast majority of the political elite in Russia, and of course, many world leaders around the world, President Xi Jinping in China, Prime Minister Modi in India, the Arab leaders, the leaders of the Arab states, MBS in Saudi Arabia, Al-Sisi in Egypt, the leaders of the BRICS states, President Lula in Iran, President Ramaphosa in South Africa. Most leaders in the world are also quietly relieved that he is staying on. So that tells you 2 things. Firstly, how much opinion about certain things, about term limits and about Putin's own position, has changed since 2020 when the constitution, the Russian legal system, was reshaped to allow Putin to stand for a 3rd and 4th consecutive term, but also, again, the pivotal role that President Putin is currently exercising in global affairs. And by the way, the last is remarkable, given that the Western powers have for years now, but especially since February 2022, when the conflict in Ukraine began, well, for years now, the Western powers have been conducting an extraordinary personal campaign against him. They've essentially boycotted him from their countries. They don't receive him or speak to him. And of course, the International Criminal Court in The Hague, which seems to follow very much Western opinions and Western dictates, has actually indicted him and has issued an arrest warrant against him. It seems that the more the Western countries go after Putin, the more his international stature grows. And there is a very interesting fact in itself, and there is cause and effect, and I would suggest that the cause and effect is quite complex. I think, on the one hand, Putin's international stature grows, in part because the Western powers are so hostile to him. But of course, I also think that Western hostility to Putin grows in large part because his international stature is increasing and because of many things that he is doing domestically within Russia and in international relations. Anyway, I'm going to return to the topic of Putin later in this program, setting aside that he's now standing for the presidency again in March 2024 and is all but guaranteed to be re-elected. He's been extremely busy over the last couple of days. I've already discussed his visits to the Arabian Peninsula, to the UAE and to Saudi Arabia. I'll have a little more to say about his meeting with Raisi in Moscow. I am going to touch on the discussion, the meeting he had with the Crown Prince of Oman, but I will also say quite a lot about this speech that he delivered to the International Investment Forum in Moscow. And by the way, and before I return to all those topics, can I also say that apparently Putin is now planning to conduct one of his gigantic marathon press conferences. He didn't have a press conference like that last year, but it seems that he will this year. It will be interesting to see whether the Western media attends, and if they do, what questions they ask, assuming, of course, that they're allowed to ask him questions. But anyway, Putin busy and Putin here to stay. What else has been going on? Well, the other big news is in the United States. And yesterday I talked about the fact that the Senate had actually voted against a procedural bill to allow funding for Ukraine, the issue of funding for Ukraine to go forward. And we've now been getting lots of reports about the incredible acrimony, the immense anger and bad temper that is now raging in Washington over this issue. And what has attracted the most attention are certain extraordinary comments which have been attributed to Defense Secretary Lloyd Austen. Now, Tucker Carlson, who's been very busy on X recently, he says that whilst briefing members of the House of Representatives in order to try to get them to agree to support the aid package for Ukraine, Lloyd Austen appears to have lost his temper. That's the only way I can explain it, if he really did say these words. Apparently he told the representatives that if they didn't appropriate more money for Ukraine, then, quote, we'll send your uncles, cousins and sons to fight Russia. And these are pretty astonishing words, and understandably enough, there's been some questions of Tucker Carlson as to whether or not Lloyd Austen really did say them. And Tucker Carlson, in response to a direct question from Elon Musk, I can actually quote the exchange on X. He said, Elon Musk asked this question. He really said this, he being, of course, Lloyd Austen. Tucker Carlson replied, he really did, confirmed, and others who have been equally astonished have included people like the Republican candidate, the candidate for the Republican nomination, Vivek Ramaswamy. So, well, there we go. It's something I haven't heard Lloyd Austen use this language myself. I haven't heard him say this, but Tucker Carlson, who, by the way, had a meeting, or gave an interview, in fact, with a Republican member of the House of Representatives, I believe shortly after this meeting with Lloyd Austen. Anyway, Tucker Carlson insists that Lloyd Austen did actually say this very thing. And for the record, I haven't seen anyone come out so far and say that Tucker Carlson is wrong. I haven't seen anybody straightforwardly contradict him. Now, the language attributed to Lloyd Austen is intemperate and wild, but it is consistent with what other US officials are saying. Even as Congress has been becoming increasingly skeptical about the question of aid for Ukraine, the administration has been resorting to one argument after another. A couple of days ago, they were saying that aid for Ukraine is necessary because it's beneficial to the US economy. It provides jobs in the US industrial sector. That was one of their arguments. A few weeks before, they were arguing, and in fact there were all kinds of commercials appearing on US television arguing that US aid for Ukraine is a good investment, that it is depleting and weakening Russia's armed forces, and that it only accounts for something like 3% of the US defense budget, and that this is an enormous value for money which the United States is getting from this for this aid to Ukraine. Now they're saying something completely different, and not only completely different, but just to a certain extent in contradiction to those two other claims. And it's no longer beneficial economically to the US to provide money to Ukraine, and it's no longer the case, apparently, that all this aid to Ukraine is actually weakening Russia. On the contrary, Russia is going from strength to strength. It is in close, or becoming dangerously close, to winning the war in Ukraine. And if it does win the war in Ukraine, as I discussed in my program yesterday, Russia will come after the various other NATO countries. They will advance further into Eastern Europe. They will threaten the Baltic states. And now we have Lloyd Austen and John Kirby, the National Security Council spokesman, coming out and saying that unless we provide this aid for Ukraine, then war with Russia is all but inevitable, because the Russians will just go advancing ever further west. I spoke about that in yesterday's program. I said that this reinvention of the discredited domino theory of the 1960s, which was used to justify the war in Vietnam by the administration today to justify further funding for Ukraine, is as fallacious, as absurd today as was the original domino theory when it was first conjured up in connection to the war in Vietnam way back in the 1960s. Vietnam fell to the communists, but the other dominoes didn't fall. And there is no reason to think that this war, once it's concluded, will lead to a further Russian march west. But the fact that Lloyd Austen is talking in this way, this incredibly intemperate language that he is using, does confirm the amount of opposition and resistance that the administration is now running in from Congress. And I have to say that the pressure on Congress is now intensifying. We've seen this in this extraordinary language from Lloyd Austen, and now the British Foreign Secretary, Lord Cameron, has also weighed in. He says that if Congress fails to provide an aid package to Ukraine, then that will be the best possible Christmas present for Vladimir Putin. Well, there we are. So all this pressure, and it's important to stress that the pressure might succeed. I was reading on Axios that the chairs of several House committees, including the Foreign Affairs and Defense committees, who are presumably Republicans, are apparently now calling for aid to be provided to Ukraine. And I suspect a lot will now depend on the stance of the new Speaker of the House of Representatives, Mike Johnson. Will he hold his ground? Will he insist that there has to be a package to deal with the border issues and a plan, the US border issues, and a plan about how the United States is going to take the conflict in Ukraine forward, what its plan for victory there is, or will he buckle in the face of all this pressure? And as we don't really know very much about Mike Johnson, he's only become Speaker for a very short time. We'll just have to see what exactly it is that he does. I am going to say one thing, in part qualification of what I suggested yesterday. I said that it's perfectly possible that a deal will be done by the 15th of December, when Congress rises. But it's important to say that there's no deal so far. We have the weekend before us. Today is the 9th. So when Congress returns on Monday, that will leave just 4 days for a decision, always assuming, of course, that Mike Johnson doesn't agree to keep Congress in session for a couple of days more to see whether or not this issue can be resolved. Various people are saying, and I believe this to be true, that if Congress does rise on the 15th of December and if there is no aid package for Ukraine agreed by then in that case, it's impossible for Congress to return to this issue before February. And of course, by that point, it's more than likely that further opposition to aid for Ukraine will continue to harden. Anyway, we will see what happens. But Lloyd Austen's extraordinary words, assuming he said them, which he likely did, and besides that, this resurrection of the domino theory from the 1960s gives us a sense of how fraught and stressed people in the administration are becoming as the prospect of further aid for Ukraine slips away, increasing the probability of a Ukrainian collapse next year during the election, opening up the president to the charge that he is the president who lost Ukraine. Anyway, there we are. That's where we are in the situation with the United States. Now, what about the actual situation on the battlefronts? Well, there's been a lot of news, but the news, again, continues to be very much in the same pattern as I spoke about before. It's very interesting to see how the Russians adjust their pressure across the front lines as opportunity arises and as the Ukrainians redeploy forces from one place to another. There was a report from one of the Ukrainian telegram channels, I believe it was from a resident, which basically said that Zelensky has now agreed that all Ukrainian forces, all reserve forces, must be redeployed to the Avdiivka lines, that Avdiivka must be held at all costs, that the political consequences of losing Avdiivka would be disastrous for Ukraine, and the result is that troops and men are being pulled from various parts of the front line to hold the position in Avdiivka, given that Ukraine has largely run out of reserves. And the result is that the Russians, who, by the way, are continuing their offensive against Avdiivka, are exploiting this opportunity to advance in other places. And it seems that their major advance now has been in the direction of Lima and the Oskol River. They've advanced several kilometers. They've captured various Ukrainian positions along the way. They're pushing the Ukrainians back, and the Ukrainians are struggling to find reserves to plug the gaps in their lines in this area in the north, in Liman. There is also a cascade of reports that the Russians are continuing to make significant advances in the Bakhmut area. So it seems that they're now preparing, they've now at the outskirts of Bogdanovka. They appear to be preparing for a major attack on Bogdanovka itself, this village to the northeast of Bakhmut. According to one report I saw, the main Russian forces are now just 100 meters away from the houses of this village of Bogdanovka. And importantly, the fact that they are now advancing towards Bogdanovka and have apparently cut some of the roads to the north and west of Bogdanovka, that suggests that over the last couple of days, the major Russian effort in this area has been to capture the high ground which overlooks Bogdanovka. Now, the thing to understand, as I understand, from what I've been able to glean, looking at reports in places like Slavyangrad, for example, is that these villages, Khromovo, which the Russians captured a few days ago, Bogdanovka, Klashevka to the southwest of Bakhmut, they're all in on relatively low ground, as one would expect. There are elevations, hills, dotted around them. And the secret, not just to entering and capturing these villages, is to capture the high ground. And it seems that that is what the Russians have been methodically doing over the last few days around Bogdanovka. And they've been shelling Ukrainian positions in this village, and once they've completed capture of the high ground on the north of Bogdanovka, they will be able to move into the village, and they should be able to storm it and do so, one assumes, relatively fast. And it seems that the same thing is happening, exactly the same thing, is happening with Kleshevka. From what I can understand, the Ukrainians pulled their troops out of Kleshevka some days ago. The Russians have, on occasion, sent some of their people into Kleshevka. But the high ground around Kleshevka is where the major fighting has been. And earlier today, there was a report that the major hill position north of Kleshevka, which had once been held by the Wagner organization and which was defended by the Russian military over the course of the fighting in the summer when the Ukrainians launched an offensive in this area. Well, this hill position has now been recaptured by the Russians. It seems that around Kleshevka, the Russians have some more hill positions to take, but they do seem to be on a roll. And once these hills are all taken, the Russians not only will be back in control of Kleshevka, but their control of Kleshevka will have been secured and consolidated. And once that happens, once the hills around Kleshevka have taken, then we will be in a position where all the advances that the Ukrainians have made in the area of Bakhmut since they went on the attack in this area on the 10th of May will have been finally and conclusively reversed. So, Bogdanovka near Bakhmut likely to be stormed very soon. Ukrainian positions around Kleshevka starting to collapse. The Russians gaining control of the high ground, steadily advancing in this area, and with forward units of the Russian military gradually pushing forward towards Chasiv Yar. So that is the situation around Bakhmut to the best that I can understand. And apparently it's the same in Novomikhailovo, this village near Marinka. The Russians have apparently renewed their offensive against this particular village. And yesterday there were reports that the Russians have also resumed their attacks on the remaining Ukrainian holdouts in Marinka itself. But straightforwardly, I've not heard any further news about that. And as for Avdiivka, well, there have been still more videos now from Ukrainian soldiers defending Avdiivka from the increasingly tormented 110th Brigade, complaining about their conditions, their sense of abandonment by the Ukrainian army, the fact that they've been kept in Avdiivka for weeks, and demanding that they be allowed to withdraw or to rotate out of Avdiivka, as I discussed yesterday. And all of this happening with further reports of further Russian advances in various areas to the southwest of Avdiivka. The Russians seem to be methodically working to clear up the Ukrainian defences in the southwest of Avdiivka. And it is from here, by the way, that I get the sense that Dima at the Military Summary Channel believes that the main Russian attack on Avdiivka will come at some point over the course of the next few weeks. Now, since I mentioned Dima, he is suggesting that the Russians have again pulled their troops out of Stepnoye, which is this village west of the railway tracks to the northwest of Avdiivka. This village has been the object of intense encounter battles between the Russians and the Ukrainians. The Ukrainian 47th Mechanized Brigade has been fighting determinedly there and taking heavy losses, by the way. And I suspect that most of these units that are being pulled by the Ukrainian command from other parts of the battlefronts and which have been rushed to the Avdiivka area are being sent there to try to hold the line around Stepnoye. That soldier who was interviewed by El País said a few weeks ago that if the Russians consolidate control of the railway track, get their armoured units across the railway track, he didn't mention the name of the villages, but capture and occupy and gain secure control of Stepnoye and Berdichi, then it is game over and the trap in Avdiivka is shut. So it's clear that the Ukrainians are doing everything they can to prevent that happening. Zelensky and possibly Zaluzny as well have ordered that Avdiivka must be held at all costs. And I suspect holding Avdiivka is now as important for the determination of the power struggle in Kiev as it is in terms of the ultimate outcome of the war. So Ukrainian troops from every part of the front line are being fed to Avdiivka, weakening Ukrainian positions and elsewhere. And we see that now increasingly also in the area where Ukraine carried out its major offensive. There's increasing numbers of reports that the Russians are now pushing the Ukrainians harder and harder in the Rabotino, Verbovoye area, and there are even some claims that the Russians are edging towards recapturing and regaining full and secure control of Rabotino itself, which would be a very bitter blow for the Ukrainians if it does indeed happen. What I would say about this is that we don't yet know. I'm not quite sure what exactly is going to happen, whether the Russians are aiming to capture Rabotino or whether that is really their plan. But there was a report yesterday, in fact, these are confirmed reports, that the Russians were able to capture 2 Bradleys. From what I can understand, one of these Bradleys definitely was in this area. And they also captured a Leopard 2 tank. Both of these vehicles essentially intact. Now, the Russians have certainly captured Bradleys before. I'm not sure whether they've captured Leopard 2s before, but it does look as if some of these vehicles were not only abandoned by their crews, but that the Russians have been able to capture them and take them back to their rear, where they can be they can be examined and taken apart by Russian engineers who can find out a bit more about how they work and what their secrets are. So, anyway, pressure on the Ukrainians there, and I'm not going to devote any more further time to Krinky and the fighting on the Dnieper River. It looks like it's the same story there. Intense Russian bombing of the Ukrainians in their bridgehead in Krinky. The Ukrainians basically trapped inside that bridgehead, suffering very, very heavy losses. And Dima at the Military Summary Channel and various people at Slavyangrad have, I think, come to see this bridgehead as essentially a Russian killing zone and the place where Ukraine's 4 Marine brigades are being decimated as troops from them are rotated in and out of this bridgehead, suffering appalling losses in the process. So, overall, same story across the front lines. The Russians pushing everywhere, conducting this constriction strategy, inflicting losses upon the Ukrainians in every place, depleting Ukrainian manpower reserves and Ukrainian equipment reserves. And at this point, I'm going to just say that something has failed to happen this week, which reports last week suggested was about to happen, and which has been much talked about in the Ukrainian and other medias for many, many weeks now. Many were expecting, I was expecting, that this week President Zelensky and the government in Kiev were going to order a mass mobilization in Ukraine, that they were going to pull into the army the young people in Kiev, the students and people like that, that they were going to call up large numbers of women as well. And interestingly, this hasn't happened. It hasn't happened this week. There's been no announcement of a mobilization. It looks as if Zelensky and his officials are having cold feet about doing this. They worry, presumably, that in the current fraught political atmosphere in Kiev, if they were to announce a mobilization like that, that might risk young people coming out onto the streets to protest. There is a fascinating article in the Washington Post which speaks about how unwilling these young people are to serve in the Ukrainian army, how the lengths to which some of them are prepared to go to avoid doing so. And it seems that Zelensky really doesn't want to do this. He probably calculates that if there was a mobilization and if large protests were to take place, it would create a crisis for his government, which, as we've discussed, is already under extreme pressure. Now, that's all very well, but the same Washington Post article pointed out that Ukraine's army remains, in fact, it is becoming even more desperately short of trained men to fight. The army is exhausted, the losses are very high, the units are depleted, nearly all of them now are under strength. Many of the men want to be rotated and are demanding that they be allowed to return to their families, to recuperate and rest. And there is an urgent need, therefore, to replace them with fresh troops, except that in terms of trained manpower, Ukraine has lost most of that as a result of the heavy losses that there have been earlier in the war. And in terms of untrained manpower, we see that there are now political obstacles to calling up the young men and the women. Now, let me repeat again briefly on this issue, a point I have made before many times. I think it would be utterly wrong for Ukraine to call up large numbers of students and young people and women, even if there were no political consequences involved in doing that. Ukraine's demographic problems are severe. Its human losses in this war have already been appalling. Adding that further tragedy of sacrificing all these young lives and the lives of all these women in the war would simply compound both the tragedy and the evolving demographic disaster. And I think it would be entirely wrong for Ukraine to do that. But of course, what I would prefer Ukraine to do, which is to contact the Russians and to try and find some kind of some way out from this war, is the one thing also that President Zelensky and his officials, and I suspect General Zaluzhny also, are structurally unable to do. So, the result is that Ukraine has to continue fighting with fewer and fewer men who are becoming increasingly jaded and tired and disaffected. The most motivated, the best trained, have already been lost. Equipment supplies, of course, are depleting. And of course, this brings us back full circle to the American funding, because even if the United States was able to come up with some great new funding package, even if it was able to cobble up more tanks and shells and all of those things, as Time magazine reported, one Ukrainian official was even then pointing out that there are fewer and fewer Ukrainian men on the battlefronts in the army who would be able to use these weapons. Anyway, the direction of travel in the war continues, the attrition continues, Ukraine's losses remain appallingly high. The Russians continue to push forward everywhere along the front lines. Their major priority remains attrition, and despite all the forces that have been redeployed to Avdiivka, it seems that the Russians are continuing their advances there. Anyway, let's move on, because even as the situation in Washington politically is becoming very fraught, Putin is brimming with confidence. Now, he had those meetings in the Arabian Peninsula, in the UAE, and in Saudi Arabia. He's clearly moving forward with major economic agreements with the Saudis and with the Emiratis. Saudi Arabia and the Emirates are about to join BRICS, and clearly those visits to the Arabian Peninsula states were, from Putin's point of view, a great success. And of course, just to reiterate, the situation in Gaza will be a topic high in the priority of discussion, and we can probably expect a further attempt to gain a ceasefire resolution from the Security Council. But Putin returned to Moscow, and he had meetings there with two important people. The first was the president of Iran, and the president of Iran spoke about the situation in Gaza, about the terrible disaster, human disaster, that is taking place there, about the effect of the bombing and all of those things by Israel. And I noticed that despite President Raisi's very, very strong words about Israel, there was no sign of any pushback from Putin in response. He clearly now agrees with what Raisi is saying. But they talked about many other things too. Raisi and Putin talked about many other things. And it's clear that the defense cooperation between Russia and Iran is now intensifying. But the single most interesting thing that they agreed was that at the end of this month, Russia and Iran, or rather, to be more precise, the Eurasian Economic Union, which is the Russian-led economic bloc, making up several of the countries of the former Soviet Union. Anyway, the Eurasian Economic Union and Iran are going to sign a free trade agreement. So that consolidates Iran's trading links with Russia, with the states of the Eurasian Economic Union, and of course it also further consolidates Iran's relations with China as well. So that is a big decision. And then Putin went straight from that meeting with the president of Iran, and he addressed this investment forum in Moscow. And in my program yesterday, in the program we did about all of this on the Duran, I touched on the things that Putin had to say about the condition of the Russian economy, how economic growth in Russia is now going to be 3.5%. The GDP growth is going to be 3.5%, where previously the West had anticipated a contraction. He talked about rising real incomes. He talked about the fact that Russia is evolving into an industrial and manufacturing power. He talked about many of these things. But perhaps the most interesting part of what he said is that he talked about the changes in the world economic system. And he laid particular stress on the financial system, the global financial system. And he said things like this: Western elites, which are currently at the top of this process, are trying to slow it down, the development of other economic centers, to create growth, to contain growth artificially in what they regard as the global periphery, that's to say places like China, Russia, India, wherever, which they have traditionally exploited and used as a resource, as a source of economic rent, and simply as a colony. And in fact, Putin went to some lengths to describe the Western powers as economic rentiers on the rest of the world. Comments which reminded me very much about of the things that Michael Hudson, for example, said over the course of a program we did with him, Glenn Deason and I, on the Duran, in which Michael Hudson spoke about the rise of a rentier class within the United States itself. And of course, Putin is now extending that analogy. I don't know how familiar he is with Michael Hudson's writings or ideas, but he's extending that to the world. So just as there is a rentier class within the United States and the Western countries, these countries themselves are increasingly becoming rentiers in terms of the economic activity of the rest of the world. I should say that Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who we've again had an interview with on the Duran, has discussed extensively, very extensively, the mechanics of much of this and the way in which the United States has been using, especially in the last 15 years, the dollar system, not just to its economic advantage, but to its geopolitical advantage as well. And then Putin went on to discuss at length how the Western powers, having become both rentiers and countries that also used to try to exploit their historic hegemonic position in the economic system, how they try to restrict development in the development of other countries. And he talked about this in a most interesting way. He said they've gone even further recently by cancelling what seemed to be timeless concepts such as property rights. Only recently we thought that the European jurisdictions were safe, that they were what was called safe havens, but this is no longer the case. They have adopted the friend or foe approach, much like IFF, identification friend or foe systems, in the Air Force. This is how they determine whether to grab someone's assets and leave them without a dime and block assets, companies or enterprises, take them away or even liquidate them after acts of sabotage like the Nord Stream pipelines. This is what competition is all about in a rules-based order. And that reminded me very much of the things that Professor Jeffrey Sachs has been saying. He's been talking a lot about the way in which the United States has, and not just the United States, the Western powers have been abusing their dominance of the global financial system to try to weaponize it in order to counter geopolitical and economic competitors. And Putin went on to say these actions undermine decades-old financial, trade and economic ties, primarily those crafted by the West. This has discredited the financial infrastructure dominated by the dollar and the euro, as well as transactions through Western banks and SWIFT. And then he went on to make comments which I suspect are going to be very controversial with some of the people who are going to be watching this program, because he then went on to say, I would even argue that the Western financial system is clearly becoming obsolete from a technological perspective. The West has remained so complacent for so long and has become used to its monopoly and exceptionalist nature that there were no alternatives, that it has grown used that there were no alternatives, that it has grown used to keeping everything as it is. This makes the current Western financial system obsolete, or at least it is about to become archaic and obsolete. And then he talks about blockchain and digital currencies through central banks, and goes on to say that according to analysts, this will pave the way for revolutionary shifts that will deprive the major Western banks of their monopoly. We see that these lenders are not in their best shape, at least some of them. So Putin sees digital currencies in a different way than perhaps some people do. In the West, perhaps in other places, people worry that digital currencies will increase state control, and perhaps they will. But Putin also sees them as an instrument of economic war, or at least of economic defense against the economic wars waged on Russia and other countries by the West. They will enable countries like Russia to bypass the Western financial system entirely, to affect trade and move money around the world without having to go through Western banks, without having indeed to touch Western banks. Central banks can deal directly with each other in ways that have not been possible up to now. And Putin then went on to discuss how there are countries where there are leaders who do not succumb to Western pressure and are guided primarily by their own national interests, and he made it fairly clear later that he considers that Prime Minister Modi of India is one of these leaders, along with himself, obviously, and Xi Jinping. And he goes on to say that these changes are now inevitable, and he cites the ease with which the Russians were able to parry the blow on their financial system from Western sanctions as an example of how it can be done. Let me remind you that one of the West's first decisions last year was to disconnect Russian banks from the Visa and MasterCard systems. The bet was that this would make it impossible to pay for goods and services, collapse payments, and therefore paralyze the country's banking sector. As some Western colleagues put it, they wanted to make our citizens suffer. These were the humanistic plans for Russian citizens. They wanted to create problems for millions of Russian families. But how did this turn out in reality? Individuals and businesses never even noticed the seamless transition to the national payment system, which is now successfully operating and expanding. We have stopped paying commissions to Western companies, so they have lost profits on what they would have earned in Russia. And he then made some very interesting comments about Russia's development. He said that in finance, industry, and the consumer market, we are gradually discontinuing the use of any imposed services, brands, or intermediaries. We're expanding our own market and seeing system-wide positive results from our dedicated efforts. And Russia is Europe's largest economy and is now ahead of all the leading EU economies in terms of growth rates. Moreover, the so-called essential non-commodity industries are accounting for an increasing share in the structure of Russia's economic growth. These include manufacturing, transport, logistics, construction, information, communications, housing, and utilities. And he then talked about the situation with the budget. And again, I recall that at the start of the year, there were many people who were talking about the fact that Russia was anticipated to suffer a budget crisis this year. And he said a few words about state finances. In the first 11 months of this year, the federal budget deficit amounted to 878 billion rubles, or about 0.5% of GDP. The consolidated budget, that is the budget of the federal government, the Russian federal government, together with the budgets of all the regions, had a surplus of 837 billion rubles. To sum up, Russia's financial system is in an absolutely normal, healthy condition. At the beginning of this year, some experts expected Russia to face a budget deficit of 3 or even 5% of GDP. Some experts predicted it would be much higher than that. And he went on to say, this would not be a disaster or even a big problem, considering our low debt. However, this did not happen. In a word, this was yet another instance of wishful thinking on behalf of those experts, and in reality, matters took a different turn as you see. Now, the most interesting thing, however, that Putin said about the budget is that it's not only going to be the case that the budget deficit this year now looks like it's going to be well below 1% of GDP. It turns out that the Russians are going to be able to cover that entire budget, not just from domestic savings, from the savings in their National Welfare Fund, but from borrowing on their own financial markets. For the first time in a long while, the federal budget deficit was fully financed by domestic resources. It is worth noting that Western portfolio investors deprive themselves of an opportunity to make money in our high-yield market. We can only sympathize with them. Let them have more influence on the sensible decisions that should be made by government structures in their country. Now, it is a major source of economic stability in a country where savings are sufficiently strong that they can cover any deficit that the government at any one time runs. And provided this thing is managed carefully, which, as we see, the Russians are doing, a deficit of less than 1% of GDP, as Putin correctly says, is very healthy state financing altogether. Anyway, provided it is managed properly, occasional or even regular borrowings by the government from the domestic financial system strengthens the financial system, because the presumption is that the government's credit is solid, and we can see that in Russia's case it is, and that way the banks, the financial institutions, sometimes even the individuals who lend to the government have a portfolio of solid investments in the form of the bonds they get in return for their loans from the government. And that also, in turn, enables banks and financial institutions that hold these secure, strong government loans, bonds, to increase their asset base, and that makes it easier for them to lend to the domestic economy, to make loans to parts of the domestic economy which might be more risky. And that is exactly in Russia what you are starting to see. I'm going to add, by the way, that in a situation where a government is able to borrow from the nation's resources, but do so in a conservative way, that over time, I also believe that this is something that will eventually strengthen the national currency. The banks will want money in rubles so that they can lend those rubles to the government. That creates a demand for rubles, and as time passes, that will strengthen the ruble relative to other currencies as well. Anyway, a very interesting speech by Putin, one very unlike any speech that you're going to get from any leader of the West. Very few no leader of the West at the moment is remotely capable of giving a speech like this. Anyway, following this speech, Putin then went on to meet the Crown Prince of Oman. And Oman is a small Gulf monarchy, which within my lifetime, in fact, within relatively recent times, was to a very great extent run by the British. The British established a dominant position in the Middle East after the First World War. They pretty much ran everything across the Middle East. For decades, the British informal empire in the Middle East started to break down in the 1950s in the aftermath, first of a coup in Egypt, which overthrew the Egyptian king, King Farouk, who had been largely controlled by the British, and then in 1958, another coup in Iraq, which brought about the overthrow of the monarchy in Iraq. But nonetheless, the British were able to keep a toehold in a few places, and the very last one was Oman. And certainly, from all accounts that I've heard, back in the 1980s, for example, there were British officials in Oman who were running, well, perhaps not everything, but most things. Anyway, that is the case no longer. Oman is now a free, independent country. And in fact, as the Crown Prince of Oman pointed out, it was in 1985 that Oman and what was then the Soviet Union established diplomatic relations. But the Crown Prince of Oman, another Arab leader, has now turned up in Moscow. He's met with Putin. They've had a friendly and excellent meeting with each other. And over the course of it, according to the Kremlin's readout, this is what the Crown Prince of Oman said to Putin. Mr. President, that's to say Putin, I listened to your speech at the opening of today's event very carefully. I would like to confirm that I share all your assessments of the current international situation, primarily with regard to the necessity of ending the current unfair world order and the dominance of the West, as well as to build a new fair world order and economic relations without double standards. So, today, in Oman, the last British toehold in the Middle East, is asserting itself. It's become, in its own self-conception, fully independent. It's reaching out to Russia. They agreed that they need to increase trade with the Russians. And here we see the Crown Prince of Oman, the person who's soon going to become, well, who will one day be the Sultan of Oman. And he says that it's time, the time has now come to end the dominance of the West and to build a new, fair world order and economic relations free of double standards, ending the current unfair world order dominated by the West. We can see the extent to which things are changing. Now, Putin is visibly at the center of all of this. He's conducted all this diplomacy with the Arab states, with the president of Iran. He's the person who's just agreed a free trade agreement with Iran. He's made this speech, which we see that one Arab leader, the Crown Prince of Oman, says he agrees with, criticizing what the West is doing and has been doing. And it's important nonetheless to remember that Putin, as important as he is just one player in this vast change in world relations that we are seeing. And a couple of days ago, there was a very interesting article in, of all places, the Financial Times. And it made a very interesting point. It said that for all the talk about China's economic problems, claims that the US and Chinese economies are the same are simply wrong. Same size are simply wrong. The reality is China's economy is bigger today than that of the US, and that it is bigger, obviously, in the only terms, the real terms that matter, which is purchasing power parity. And the article by someone called Chris Giles, whom I confess I don't know, said, "Sorry, America, China has a bigger economy than you, and measures that show the opposite have absurd implications and dangerous policy prescriptions." And the article is careful to explain why purchasing power parity is the only relevant measure for understanding the relative weight of economies. And the article goes on to say, and it's in the Financial Times, measured at purchasing power parity, the latest IMF data shows China's GDP exceeded that in the US around the time Donald Trump was trying to make America great again. It is now 22% larger. The figures make sense when you look at corroborating evidence. China's electricity generation overtook that in the US in 2010. And during the period 2016-2022, when China's economy was supposedly making no progress compared with the US, its power generation grew 45%, whilst America's remained broadly flat. And this is completely correct. There's been lots of articles recently about the supposed crisis in China's economy. The reality is China's economy is still growing, and growing faster than that of the United States and of the collective West. It has its share of economic problems, as all economies do, but the relative weight of economic power continues to shift in China's favour. And that, by the way, is in an article in the Financial Times. And in fact, this gentleman, Chris Giles, he goes on to say it comforts both the United States and China not to acknowledge the changing shift in global economic power coming from the United Kingdom, which lost its top economic dog status in the late 19th century, but still has some delusions of grandeur. I can understand American denialism. For China, it is also easier to avoid responsibilities for climate change, debt relief, and other global goods if it can still maintain its minnow status. But ultimately, bad comparisons foster bad decisions. And the logic of that is that any assumptions, any sets of policies that assume or continue to assume that America continues to be economically stronger than China and bigger than China are simply going to lead to bad decisions, which ultimately will play against the United States. Now, I have discussed China because, important as Putin is, important as Russia is, it is China ultimately that is more important still. It is the rise of China in the last 30 years that has transformed the global economic landscape and which is pulling up all the other economies in its wake. The Russians now are clearly in the process of conducting a major change in the structure of their own economy and economic relations. But it is the Chinese that remain, for the moment at least, the focus of the change that is happening. And in all of these trips that he has done, to Saudi Arabia, to Iran, to United Arab Emirates, the meetings he's had with Raisi, with the Crown Prince of Oman, China is always there in the background. And incidentally, during that investment forum, when after Putin gave his speech, he answered a few questions, and it was notable that two of the questions were asked by Chinese business people and one by a business person from India, the other country whose economy now is very much on the rise. So there we go. Fascinating set of speeches and decisions by Putin. One could see why most of the world outside the collective West very much wants him to stay as president of Russia. We can see why most people in Russia at this particular point in time want him to stay. He is clearly on the up. The war in Ukraine is going to his advantage and to Russia's advantage. And of course, most people around the world can see the contrast with the political chaos and dysfunction in the United States. Now, I've not discussed the situation in Gaza and in the Middle East at any length in this program, but if I start doing that now, this program will become impossibly long. Suffice to say that we continue to see sparring going on between some US officials and Prime Minister Netanyahu. The military campaign in Gaza that Israel is conducting continues much as before, and undoubtedly one of the reasons why Putin has been received so enthusiastically in the Arab and Muslim world is precisely because of the stance he and Russia are taking in relation to this conflict in Gaza and to the need for a ceasefire there. But as I said, I am not going to discuss this further in this program. This is in fact the point where my program ends. I will no doubt return to the situation in the Middle East and to Gaza in my next program. But on this note, my program will finish now. And just to repeat again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via our various, via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget also to check out our shop where you can buy the amazing things that you will find there. Our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.